Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's event on memory politics, the challenge of commemoration in post-Soviet Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. And as you can see, we're having a nice roundtable here at Chatham House, but also a big welcome to all our participants online. I know there are about 100 of you. So it's great to see you. And as the title suggests, today we're talking about how best to deal with the kind of past that can overwhelm the future, as Hans and David put it in their recent article. And we're doing this because how the past is remembered and commemorated plays a large role in the contemporary politics in the region that Russia and Eurasia program covers, the Russia, Eastern Partnership countries, Central Asian states, and all the contested territories as well. And these conflicting narratives running in parallel are often used to judge the actions of others and to dismiss their perspectives, and make it very difficult to move on and focus on the future and some of the key development issues in the region. So in today's event, we'll try to come up with some ideas on how societies could commemorate the events in their past in a way that helps promote mutual understanding, supports reconciliation, and includes perspectives that are often neglected in the standard narratives. And to do that, we have an excellent panel. Opposite me, Hans Gutbrod, who's an associate professor at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Elias State University in Tbilisi. Many of you are also familiar with his work in Transperify to increase the transparency of policy research around the world. And of course, Hans has previously also worked as the regional director of the Caucasus Research Resource Centers. So he's well known to you all. Next, we have David Wood, who is currently a professor of practice at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. But he has huge experience in the field of conflict prevention and peace building as well. He has been involved in the peace building processes in the Georgian, Abkhazian, and South Ossetian conflicts. And he's also consulted the Georgian Parliament on prevention of violence, and he was involved in setting up the ceasefire monitoring mechanism across the Karabakh conflict. And he has many other accolades, having worked with the UNDP, the European External Action Service, DFID, USAID, you name it. And Hans and David will share some broad ideas on ethical commemoration. And after that, we'll have Olesya Chromeychuk offering some sort of detailed perspective on how these ideas could be applied in Ukraine. So Olesya is also very well known to you. She is a historian and the director of the Ukraine Institute here in London. She has taught the history of East Central Europe at the University of Cambridge, University College London, King's College, University of East Anglia, many places. And she is the author of Undetermined Ukrainians, post-war narratives of the Waffen-SS Galicia division. And her most recent book, Loss, a story of a dead soldier told by his sister, is out from Ibidem Verlag and Columbia University Press later this month, and we'll drop a link in the chat. So please check it out. And the running order is Hans and David will open with about 10 minutes each. Olesya will then respond for another 10 minutes. And this should leave us about an hour for questions. So participants here at Chatham House, if you have a question, please catch my eye. And participants online, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and I'll take as many as I can. And just a reminder that today's event is held on the record, and we'll be publishing a video on the Chatham House website later. And yeah, that's the housekeeping from me. So without further ado, Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. If you joined here today, if you joined online, you share probably the concern or the conviction, or at least the question that or you see the question that the past has a very big influence on the present and on how current political processes are shaped, what's possible to advance in a society, and where there are also challenges that remain. Now, the way that the historian Margaret Macmillan put it, David, has put this very kind of aptly, was to say, as you see here on the slide, that in a secular world, it's history that really takes on a central role for judging. It is foundational in the way that we see our own processes, how we see our relationships. And as she says here, it can vindicate and judge us and damn those who oppose us. That arguably is heightened even further in the report you see on your right, a report from Södertörn University that I recommend to all of you. It's freely available online, with many authors, including some that will be familiar here, that shows how important memory management is to the entire region, from the Baltics across Eastern and Central Europe, all the way down to the Caucasus. So, two particular features that arguably have made this even more pronounced in the last 2 or 3 decades is first that in the absence of ideology, or with a reduced ideology, something needs to fill the vacuum that you have in a secular world. And if you want to heighten the contradiction, so to speak, or the challenge even further, as Stephen Holmes and even Krusted have argued in their book, The Light That Failed, when the promise of an easy transformation towards democracy, towards a liberal democracy, when that light has dimmed, then the question is again, what is the source of judging? How do we look at contemporary relationships? And this is where the power of history comes in. Yet when you look for how to evaluate history and commemoration, and you just do a simple Google search, you will find an ethics for accounting, you will find an ethics for nursery, you will find ethics for many, many professions, but there isn't really an ethics of commemoration. There isn't really a cogent approach that's been put forward. And so what we're here today to suggest is to say, we think that there is a plausible approach. We think that that approach is comprehensive. We think it is internally consistent. And the reason why we think it's a plausible approach is because it corresponds broadly to the just war tradition, the very old tradition, Thomas Aquinas, revived by Michael Walzer, with the express purpose, as Michael Walzer put it, to interrogate and to scrutinize and to offer an immanent critique. And so this is what we suggest we think is possible with the approach that we put forward today as well. Now, a couple of things it does do, and a couple of things it does not do. So this does matter, not just for a discussion of historians, that's very important to us. And Ljubica had mentioned that, of course, that it has a broader context. It is about actions that signify importance. So things you, so to speak, you own and do. Those can be museum projects, memorial site projects, remembrance days or awards, or as in the context of Ireland, a decade of centenaries recently. It can be actions to disown, removing statues, a topic that, of course, is not just one that we have in Eastern Europe, though with Stalin's statue, for example, that is a big topic in Georgia today and in other places. It can, secondly, it's about materially affecting the present. Closed borders, the inability to open up, but also questions like, say, like reparations or illustration, and then commission statements, conventions. And then there's a context in which we affect the present, in which we have a very heavy impact on the present through norms, but also in some cases through laws, like memory laws. And we'll discuss some of that. What's important here is that we operate is a grand word, but that we suggest that there is still, in an important way, a public-private distinction. We talk about political commemoration when it is about vindicating and judging others and compelling potentially others to act in certain ways. So this is not meant to suggest a framework for private mourning, for example, for private remembrance, more for artistic expression. So it is in the political context that we're most interested here. And the framework that we suggest leans up, as we said, or draws on, and synthesizes and transposes in a way some core ideas of the just war framework. I'm not going to go through the just war framework right now because we want to advance this, but you can see that how it breaks down is similar to the way that the just war framework or just war tradition, or maybe in a better way of putting it, when is the use of force justifiable? I have some problems myself with the idea that it's just, but that it's justifiable is a more moderated approach here. So this breaks down really in two parts. First, what we now name for this context, the use ad memoriam, about the occasion. Is it all right to mobilize commemoration? And then the use in memoria. I'll talk now about the ad memoriam, and then David will cover the in memoria part. And that together, this idea of an ethics of political commemoration. David? Now, how should we kind of walk into this idea of commemoration as indicated there in the image? And there are really four considerations that we think are relevant. First, it's the right intention. And very obviously, a right intention is grounded, obviously is maybe too strong, but the just war tradition has at its core idea creating a better peace. And in some ways, I think something similar one can argue for appropriate commemoration, creating a better future, bridging divides, bringing people together, crossing things, crossing an abyss that previously was not possible to cross. Jay Winter put it this way: it's not the act of remembrance in itself that is problematic, the historian Jay Winter, but it's the motives and the intentions that are often associated with that when it gets mobilized against others and to sharpen the divides. So right intention as a key consideration, and then a second consideration that is also important for the just war tradition is the question of legitimate authority. Here, in this case, we mean that differently from the way it's framed in the just war tradition. In the just war tradition, it's typically, well, if you are a sovereign that can begin and end conflict, then you have a degree of, you qualify, so to speak, for that. Here we really mean something, two different bits. First, that of course authority matters, but also that to be legitimate, it is important that commemoration should not be a way of charging authority or especially of undermining attempts to hold authority accountable. And this, I think, describes a key problem in some ways with some of the ways that commemoration has been mobilized, that it's been an attempt to solidify positions of power rather than to create a space in which directions of a country can be discussed. And here, one way in which we see that the Aurora Prize, a particularly remarkable initiative coming out from the context of Armenia, started primarily by Armenians, how they legitimated what they do. David will talk more about that. You see a board that has very diverse backgrounds, from a Holocaust survivor that was instrumental for the Nuremberg processes across the face of an actor that you will recognize, but also Bertrand Kouchner, who started Médecins Sans Frontières. And so that in that way, it is a really broad-based approach to legitimate authority in the context of commemoration. Next. Then one key criterion in terms of asking when is it appropriate to mobilize, to compel others, is the question of a reasonable chance of success. Undertaking things that are likely to fail are not seen as justifiable. And we argue that somewhat similar aims in commemoration should be aims that have a reasonable chance of succeeding. This means that empirical social research actually really matters. There is an important place for the kind of work, I'm highlighting here some work from my former colleagues, who there's just one snippet of asking a question of what would be acceptable to people in Georgia in their relationship to South Ossetia. I also think that highlights the relevance of ground up work. And then secondly, the other image that I show in terms of legitimate success is an image of a virtual attempt of creating virtual remembrance in the context of the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial, where precisely one of the potential criticisms is that it's a technological experiment, and that certain kinds of commemoration, if they're undertaken in a political context, maybe are not the right arena, because that experimenting with technology in a way stands potentially in some contrast to successful commemoration. And then also just cause. This is often a starting point for considerations of how to commemorate. Unfortunately, it's often also the end point of these discussions, where the attempt is in grounding a particular just cause. And we think that it's really only when you take everything together, as in the tradition of just war, that it begins to make sense. And we also think that some of the emphasis on establishing just how just a particular cause is, a kind of immaculate cause, in a way has been a problem, because it has corrupted scholarship, or distorted scholarship, let's say it. And we think that very broadly conceived, let's just take one example there. By most standards, it is clear that the East Timor pacification does not constitute a genocide, and it still is absolutely a just cause for the people of Timor and beyond Timor to commemorate and to remember in their own way. So this wraps up the idea of the kind of ad memoriam bit, and now David for the in memoriam.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've talked a little bit, or Hans has talked about how to make decisions on when to commemorate. Now I want to run you through some ideas around how to commemorate. And certainly the reason for this partnership is because, certainly for me, I'm a practicing conflict mediator. I work in conflict zones, and that's been at the point of violence, for example, on ceasefires and so on, but it has also been around negotiating aid and government arrangements. And what I see is that that process of move towards peace, of conflict transformation, is not possible without dealing with the past. And so when people think about the past, they often categorize it as, we're understanding the past. Great. But you're also understanding the future, because the stories, the narratives that we tell about the past, we take forward to our vision of the future. We have this image around what we're going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years, and the relationships that will be there between us and the ones that we love, and us and the ones that we have a traumatic relationship with. And then both of those, the past and the future, influence what we do now. And it influences how we negotiate the issues of concern to us, such as political control, territorial status. It influences the way we manage relationships and how we treat each other, especially across conflict divides. And it then influences the respect that we have for institutions, our trust in institutions that are shared to manage us and our relationships. And just to take a context outside of the Caucasus, because sometimes that can, and the Eastern Europe, that sometimes that can help. A good example is that after the 2011 civil war or revolution in Libya, my role was to go and speak to different constituencies, communities around how to get a peaceful future. And each one had a marginalization narrative based upon the human rights abuses of the Gaddafi era, or of the violence enacted to them in the recent past. And because of that, no one trusted shared institutions. So when the UN was going through a process of trying to demobilize, disarm, me and the then Minister of the Armed Forces were saying, you can't do that because people don't trust. You have to work on the stories first and then get to the hard policy points. So this isn't a conceptual framework. For me, this is a proven approach to stopping war and stopping violence. And what that means is that when we memorize, when we commemorate, it's essential that we do so in a way which doesn't essentialize the other or us, doesn't say they're evil and we're good, that can spot the nuance in the landscape of the past. And there are some very brave academics and historians across the region who do this, who challenge the essentialization of the other. And that's something we need to promote. because if we don't, then we don't have a chance of exiting circular narratives. And we all know about circular narratives on social media and how we get caught into listening to the same points from an echo chamber. But that has an important implication that we start to then judge ourselves separately from the other. We start to condemn the violence of the other and the actions of the other when we don't condemn the same actions from our own camp. And it's important that we have these methods of distinguishing. Slight personal story, and it might distract for 1 minute, that I'm not on social media because of the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict and my own experiences of how, at that point, I was trying to build communication skills across young Azeris and Armenians. And they were caught in this trap of social media, of showing the bodies of each other's sides. And while in the room we were talking about peace, online, they were in these narratives of commemoration that were hurtful towards each other. And I didn't want to get caught in that trap. Another point is asserting moral autonomy. A lot of our potential is constrained by the pain and suffering that we've had in the past. Although I sound English, I'm actually an Irishman. And in the Irish tradition of James Joyce, we'd say the Irish have two nooses around their neck, British Empire and the Catholic Church. And that's a reference to both how we are constrained, but also how we constrain ourselves, the way that we judge ourselves, the way that we don't see a separate future. And I think this plays out within the region where commemoration is used to justify internal repression, eternal suppression of human rights, moves to stop democratic processes because we have the evil enemy, because we need to deal with this issue that's more pressing. And the last point is on contained unfathomability. We were trying to work out how to say this the best way, but I suppose in summary, we shouldn't get caught up on numbers. It's the types of experience that are important. It doesn't matter when 10,000 people or 50,000 people are forced from their home. Being forced from your home is a suffering that no one should endure. And I've certainly seen that. We were talking about Syria, in Syria, where families have been forced from their home. It's not categorized as ethnic cleansing or genocide, but it is of the same nature. So if we want to humanize these events, numbers isn't the way to do it. The categories of experience are. And that's a challenge certainly in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet area. But the most important thing, and I'm a practitioner, is how do we apply this? So we've got 2 case studies and then some policy recommendations that we're looking very much for Alicia to then see and play with in terms of the Ukrainian context. If you get that. The first one, and I suppose you'll already know that we're very positively inclined towards the Aurora Prize. So for those of you who don't know it, the Aurora Prize is a prize on behalf of the survivors of the Armenian genocide and its saviors. And there's a $1 million prize that is given to people who have showed that they've saved lives or advanced humanitarian causes. And this is a stamp to commemorate this prize. Now, why do we judge this well? Because in terms of the right intention, it's not there to blame or vilify the other. It is a strong statement around celebration of saviors, those who have saved people, irrespective of their background, and the celebration of the agency and the hard work of those people. And it also asserts moral authority. So I'm just choosing 2 from our grading scale, because it's a statement that Armenia, because of its suffering in the past, has the right and the ability to make statements around those people that save lives. They have the right to say, this is a good thing. So it's a positive formation of the past in terms of a right to acknowledge a savior. On the other side, we have some memory laws, and we're struggling with these. So we're talking generically here. So around the memory laws that we see in the region, which really trying to restrict what is said and published about the past. So in good faith, this is a good faith analysis, and we see that they fall down on a couple of places. Firstly is that they have a real chance to protect authorities, to reinforce their power within a context and to shield them from criticism. And we've seen this in some places in the region. We also believe that they don't help us to exit circular narratives, because they really constrain what is possible to say about the past, really fix the truth. And so we don't feel that this is ethically good political commemoration. It could be, if we thought through it again, because we're not just looking to score here, we're looking to have a nuanced discussion around how we engage with these difficult conversations on commemoration. So in summary, and one point which we didn't have in there, do your social research around how people think about commemoration. Otherwise, you're not going to design it well. Apply it institutionally. Commemoration ombudsman. The OSCE could work on commemoration. How do we institutionalize these frameworks of thinking about the past? We need a tool that dialogues on commemoration between parties, whether that's inside a place like Ukraine, those of Russian-speaking background and those who are not, or between Ukraine and Russia, or between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We need a tool, and we think this could help. It's important to right-size justice. Justice is essential, but it exists in relationship to these other dimensions that we discussed. The last 2 points are big ones, so I won't get through to them, but if we have someone wants to ask me a question and answer what you mean prioritization and spheres of legitimate disagreement, then I'll happily come back to that. Thank you if I run over.
Thank you. Alessia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me, allowing me to be part of this discussion. I will speak as researcher today, and I will talk about the Ukrainian case. And I'm not sure if I'll respond directly to the issues that you've raised, but I will try and give some examples and thoughts about the case of Ukraine, which will hopefully expand our discussion later on, and the discussion about the challenges of commemoration. And I'll begin with a brief anecdote, which happened 5 years ago in one of Kyiv museums when I was visiting an exhibition on the Babin Yar massacre, in which, for those of you who might not know, in which nearly 34,000 Kyiv Jews were murdered in 1941, and then throughout the occupation of Kyiv by the Nazis, 100,000 Kyiv residents were killed on the site. So I was visiting the museum, and by one of the information boards, there was a young guide with a group of school children, and she was explaining the various victims of the Babin Yar massacre, which also included the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, a controversial formation that is known to have not just been, whose members are known not to have just been the victims of the Nazi regime, but also some of whom collaborated with the Nazi regime too. And she was listing the various victims, and then she paused and asked the children whether they knew the difference, well, whether they knew what the letters M and B stood for in the abbreviated versions of the OUN M, which is the faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that supported Andrei Melnik as their leader, and OUN B, which supported Stepan Bandera as their leader. And I thought this is way too much detail to bring up in this discussion with school children. I was a little surprised and also curious to hear what she was going to say. The children didn't know what the letters stood for, so the guide had to explain or answer her own question. And she said, M stands for Mensheviks and B stands for Bolsheviks, right? And so what I realized at that moment is that both the pupils and the guide, for them, the Second World War was just as much ancient history as the 1917 revolution with its Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, right? And part of me felt relieved. I thought, well, maybe that's not so bad. Maybe that means that the young generation is no longer defined by the traumas of the past, right? Also, this was the time when historians, including myself, were engaged in really heated discussions of the memory laws, of so-called decommunization laws that were passed by the post-Maidan parliament in Ukraine. But to be honest, it was also the time when most of Ukrainians were dragged into these memory wars reluctantly or very reluctantly. So this is perhaps goes back to this idea of you need to do your social research to see the attitudes of society towards memory politics or commemorative practices. So this episode in the museum took place at the time when a new war was already raging only 500 miles away from Kyiv. And it became apparent to me at the time that our lack of experience in commemorating past conflicts, past wars sensitively, left us unprepared to face the challenge of commemorating the unfolding conflict, the war of today. And of course, historical experience, as we all know, can be a useful tool in processing the present and also looking to the future, as you identified, provided this history is not instrumentalized. But the war in the Donbass was accompanied by information warfare, fueled by the growing World War II victory industry in Russia. And even in the 7th year of the war, this year, on the eve of the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence, Russia's president issued a pseudo-historical thesis, which he called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And to be honest, reading it brought to mind Stalin's 1948 book, Falsifiers of History, in which the attention was diverted completely from the role of the USSR in the Second World War, in the division of Europe into spheres of influence, and onto the West's role as culpable for the outbreak of the Second World War. And Putin's message in this article, which I'm sure many of you have looked at, is very clear. History says that there is no Ukrainian nation. So, instrumentalizing history, Russia's frequent questioning of Ukraine's nationhood has put the Ukrainian state on the defensive, right? And it is not surprising that the Ukrainian state endorsed narratives about the ongoing war, turned immediately to parallels with historic wars. For instance, I'll just give you one example. Actually, there's quite a few examples like that. In 2018, the young cadets who had fought against the Bolsheviks in 1918 in the Battle of Krute were presented as the first cyborgs. And that was a direct parallel comparison with the fighters for Donetsk airport, who were nicknamed cyborgs. And there were many examples like that. But this celebratory memory politics provided a temporary dressing stitched together from fragments of historic victories and glorious defeats. And sooner or later, that sort of dressing would become insufficient in helping the new wounds heal. And there were also quite a lot of those who were not happy with the celebratory approach or felt that this was not enough. So the number of NGOs, journalists, and scholars who tend to focus on the families of the dead and also to lobby to improve the lives of those who survived is growing in Ukraine at the moment. They reach out to state agencies who have the authority to implement their suggestions of sensitive and responsible commemoration of the casualties of war. And actually, the number of the casualties right now stands at 13,000 people. So it's extremely high and it keeps growing. But this authority alone is not enough. There needs to be the political will to choose constructive practices over politically profitable ones. And this political will is frequently in low supply in Ukraine, as the case of Babyn Yar actually continues to demonstrate. And I'll briefly come back to that. So it's been 5 years since that episode in the Kyiv Museum that I described at the beginning. Ukraine has just marked the 80th anniversary of the Babyn Yar massacre. And it is really clear that this tragedy is no longer just of interest to historians or people with direct connection to those who perished in the Babyn Yar. It's been presented, including by the state, as a shared tragedy of all Ukrainians, regardless of their ethnicity and even political ideological positions. And so the pupils visiting a Babyn Yar exhibition today are likely to encounter a more nuanced and perhaps less confused narrative about events or the site. But the confusion continues to exist at a high official level. So there's a Ukrainian project developed by historians, architects, lawyers, and endorsed by various NGOs who work on Ukrainian Jewish relations, and endorsed by the Institute of National Memory and the Ministry of Culture, right? So it exists, it's developed, but it has been sidelined in favor of a private initiative funded by a group of oligarchs with clear Kremlin ties, whose plans for the Babyn Yar memorial are as ambiguous as the origins of the money that is available to fund it. So this site of the massacre, much like Ukrainian memory politics more widely, remains vulnerable to exploitation by people with deep pockets and dubious intentions. And if the central wound of the country of the Second World War period is not protected by the state, then what hope is there that the new commemoration sites of the new conflict that is still ongoing will be treated with the sensitivity that they call for? Now, as is often the case in Ukraine, the hope, in my view, lies with civil society. Independent cultural initiatives, the fantastic theater productions, I'd be happy to talk about them in more detail, documentary and film and feature films often replace some of these initiatives that perhaps the state should look after, and offer a platform for complex, thoughtful discussion of the ongoing war. Also, activists, and I'd like to highlight the work of Alexandra Matvichuk here, Center for Civil Liberties, continue to apply pressure on the government to ensure that appropriate war crime legislations are passed, because it is difficult to imagine commemoration, reconciliation between victims and perpetrators of war crimes unless commemoration is preceded by justice. I'd like to hear what you've got to say about this, specifically relating to the ongoing case of a violent conflict. And also discussions about the meaning of transitional justice are initiated by lawyers, and in particular Katerina Busel, who should be familiar to people in this room, as she was the associate of Chatham House. And I'd like to end with an example of one particular NGO who set up a project that they called "What Does It Mean to Remember?" And it aims to create a new vision of commemorative practices of those who died in Donbass, right, specifically. And on their website, they state that this project is not about plaques, candles, or renaming streets. It is about what conclusions we will draw from the tragic story and where we will go next. And they're hoping to produce a report and to hopefully recommend this to the appropriate ministries as well. And the next stage really is a development of tools for responsible and sensitive commemoration. And if commemorative practices answer the question, what does it mean to remember, with complete honesty, then I think pupils like those in the Kiev Museum that I described at the start of my talk are less likely to stay indifferent after hearing about both the stories of past conflicts for the conflict of today. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much, Alicia. So before I open the floor, Hans and David, do you have any comments in response to the issues that Alicia has raised?
I'm still taking it in. Thank you. There's lots of material and lots of interesting things to follow up on, including that was exactly in a way the kind of conversation we had hoped for, with highlighting some of the work that goes on.
Okay, well, the floor is open then, and while people are still thinking, maybe I'll kick off with a practical question. You all raised the issue of political will, and the region, especially working in Russia and Eurasia program, the region I work on, for many countries, for many governments, the primary question is the question of regime stability and quick political gains. So what would you say? How do you think, or is there a way of motivating these kinds of governments to actually pursue the kind of commemoration that you were talking about? Because from all you have said, it's very hard work. It would be a very hard work for them, and with no immediate gain, or not immediately obvious gain. So what would you say to them to try and persuade them?
Yeah, great. And I do want to come back to the justice question later within the main debate, because that is the shifting lava sands that we're stood upon. Where do we situate justice versus relationships? In terms of the political will, it is a critical question as well for a couple of reasons. But I think what we're suggesting is that one way of addressing this is to hold political parties and governments to account when they try to commemorate, to actually interrogate whether they have the right intent. And so that's one of the principal things we're trying to do. Do you have the right intent in how you're approaching this? Are you looking to genuinely commemorate, or are you looking to reinforce your own position within society? And that happens, and it happens all the time. The other part, though, is I think that we also need to presume good intent, that within a conflict situation, this is where the prioritization point comes in, you'll have an emphasis on different facts in the history, depending upon which side you're on. And people in authority can legitimately believe the statements they're making about the past. And unless we believe that they legitimately believe them and we engage with that, then we can't really look to get them to have a wider sense of commemoration. A good example, which I know Hans wanted me to be wary of, is the Tagliavini report after the 2008 war over Georgia. In a sense, that was an early, immediate attempt at commemoration. What happened? To try and establish a shared framework. And it did to a degree. But what it also pointed out is that the parties reference different parts of history as more important. Do we talk about the gathering together of different ethnicities within one Soviet republic? Do we talk about the work of Gamsa Khurdia and his nationalism and how he made minorities afraid? Do we then talk about the displacement of Georgians from Abkhazia and South Ossetia and their inability to return? Do we talk about the Russian involvement in terms of propping up the two local authorities and being set against Georgian government? Do we talk about Saakashvili's overt moves towards war? All of those things happened. Commemoration prioritizes certain points as being more important.
And if I could add to that, I think that there are several important points here. First, when you look at the way that that commemoration often gets criticized, including the kind of affirmative commemoration that tries to strengthen those in authority, the language of that often is rather simple, and it's improvised and it's ad hoc. And so part of our suggestion is you need a cogent framework to say, well, this and this seems to be going in the right direction, but this particular component seems to be missing. So some of the things that Olesia has just said, that people with questionable, in a slightly different wording, but with questionable intentions, dubious intentions, and uncertain source of money. So questions about legitimacy. So what we're trying to say is you don't need to improvise every single time and go, yeah, I have a sense that something's wrong there, but I'm trying to improvise the response, but rather here's a broader framework. The second component of that is, and this is more of a hunch and a guess, and I may be entirely wrong with that, but part of my hunch is that in a way, the weakness of many opposition parties is also described by, in a way, maximalist politics that is in some ways grounded in I think, almost apocalyptic view of politics. And again, Olesia had highlighted that, the way that victory and defeat are drawn in stark terms, that there's a cosmology of heroes versus martyrs. And I think that in a way ends up being a process that cements oligarchic dominance in that kind of space in Russia and Eastern Europe that we look at. And the kind of politics that is needed to make a difference and to convey to citizens that it's worth protecting their vote and it's worth not selling their vote needs to be one that's really appropriately grounded in a kind of cosmology that's real to them, because heroes and martyrs is not something that connects necessarily terribly well. Absolutely, if you're right in the middle of a war, but in many of the contexts it doesn't.
May I respond quickly? So I think in the Ukrainian case, I'll come back to this idea of civil society. It's a very generalized term, and perhaps it's not that useful to use it, but just to save time. It does have a very powerful voice, and it has a voice that is respected. And I think the criticism that decommunization laws faced of the academic community and also civil society. I mean, a lot of people supported the idea of decommunization as such. Few people in Ukraine wanted to pass the Lenin monument, in 2016 or whatever. We've had enough of walking down Dzerzhinsky Street. But the means that we used to implement decommunization, but also the laws, the fact that they were not developed sufficiently, there's contradictions within them, they are occasionally manipulative and so on. That was discussed widely, and it was discussed for quite a long time. And I think Poroshenko paid for it, essentially, and his political force, as we saw in the most recent presidential election. Part of his defeat was because of his conduct of memory politics, and I think it's quite an aggressive position of the Institute of National Memory during his time in power. And I think the institution of the Institute of National Memory learned its lessons. I don't want to draw conclusions just yet, but watching what they're doing at the moment, I mean, a lot of it has changed. The approach has changed. They're also decentralizing. They are listening. They are trying to go, into regional branches and listen to the needs of people in different parts of Ukraine as well, and their views on memory politics, which I think is really useful. Whether the political elites more generally really have learned their lessons, I'm not sure. And that brings me back to the case of Armenian and this kind of controversy with the Memorial Center, because it's obvious the Ukrainian society wants transparency, wants discussion, wants to be consulted on how these sort of things are implemented. And the concept that is the private concept that I described that is being implemented, things are being built on the site of Armenian. There's various artistic installations have been put up already, is not done in that transparent way with public consultation. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there.
Gary, you have a question.
I'm Kerry Kavanaugh from University of Kentucky, but also international alert and previously a mediator. You've thrown a lot of interesting things on the table. I like this concept. But I think there's a challenge here too, that commemoration is often a tool of statecraft. And David, you talked about the need to try to do this sort of reconciliation and communicate and commemoration before you do the mediation or the peace settlement. I fear it's almost impossible for reasons Alessia has raised. And it's the receptivity to it, I think, is in civil society. And I think the template you're laying out really is one for civil society to use. I was involved in a conciliation resources project, making a film Parts of a Circle, which we screened down the hall here at Chatham House. And it was bringing Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and people from Karabakh, both communities together to talk about what they saw. They had a really, if you see the film, you'll see that, but I'll tell you behind it, they had a very hard time doing this because they were attacking their own narratives in bringing in detail of, yeah, the state describes it as that, but it was more like this. And the state says they were horrible, but they were my neighbors and I invited them into the apartment and protected them. So I think the model is going to be good. The trick is going to be how you target it, where you use it. And it may be helpful in that from a mediation standpoint, it gives mediators that they try to keep government out of this stuff and have people, civil society try to tackle.
Yeah, all points are beautifully put. And I remember the conciliation resources videos and films, which are quite wonderful. The question is always, I mean, you know this better than me, that in mediation, you're looking for the meaning makers, those people who not only create exceptions in the room with people from the other side, you know, I'm an Azeri, you're an Armenian, together we can love each other in the room, but also help shape the way that the rest of society thinks about it. And this is where memory politics more broadly does come into it, because those films, which, well, great, have little chance of reverberation and change within society. That's where the institutions matter. That's where the politics at the top matter. And apologies if I misarticulated. I don't think it's a question of you've got to do all the reconciliation, you've got to do all the meaning making before you come back to the hard politics. I think you need to balance and sequence it a little bit better. And we don't often do that. We often think of the mediation process as one of agreement on an issue. And it's not. The space for that agreement is set by the stories that are told by the parties about the past and the future. And I think your point around justice, just to kind of make the link, is the hard one, because we are immediately, commemoration isn't 10 years down the line. As events are happening within Ukraine, people are commemorating the next day, commemorating the last ones, the ones that were killed. It happens immediately, and you know, then you get a past dependency in the future. So it's also work we need to start earlier on. And I certainly don't have the right answer around justice versus kind of peace and reconciliation, but you do need to do both again, I think, at the same time. And again, it's about the right intention. So we were trying to situate a search for justice within inside the wider commemoration. So it's not just about justice, you also need to think about your relationships. And again, as the ambassador would know, that when you're doing mediation, then what you're looking for is these shared sources of references. So you need both parties to agree to the same justice mechanism. Otherwise, it's one version of the truth coming out. But no, justice versus peace is a horrible debate. Yeah. An important one. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from our online audience, from Robert Brinkley. In Ukraine, many people remember the Soviet period as a time of totalitarian and Russian imperialist oppression, but it was for others it was the context of their lives, and how best to draw the line between what should be remembered and preserved and what should be forgotten.
Wonderful.
Well, a few things I'd like to say about that. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, these decommunization laws were not discussed sufficiently before they were passed. It was all done in a rush, and that created some of the problems. And I think one of the reasons why they were not discussed, and that's not to justify them not being discussed, not at all, I think they should have been for sure, was because they were essentially legislating around something that was already happening. You know, the Lenin monuments were already being toppled during the Maidan. That was the first one, and it continued. So the parliament, I think, responded very quickly to something that was already taking place. But it's problematic that they were not discussed, that the local communities were not consulted, that scholars were not consulted sufficiently, and so on. And yes, and then there was a certain agenda, I think, especially with the laws in relation to commemoration of certain types of military formations as fighters for Ukrainian independence, which actually is a contradictory law. And I won't bore you with this. I mean, I've been researching collaboration during the Second World War, and it's extremely contradictory. Who can be and can't be perceived as a fighter for Ukrainian independence? So, for instance, you know, people who took part in German formations or formations that fought on the side of the Third Reich, like Schutzmannschaft battalions, should not be seen as fighters for Ukraine's independence, right? But Roman Shukhevich is seen as a fighter for Ukraine's independence because he subsequently participated in the UPA, Ukrainian insurgent armies. Very complicated business. The laws themselves don't really talk to each other properly. Anyway, so without going into too much detail, so they were not discussed sufficiently, but also they were not implemented necessarily correctly according to the way that they were described on paper. For instance, there was already a distinction, there is already a distinction between what can and can be removed. Graves are not to be touched. So any monuments that actually are to, say, I don't know, unknown soldier or so on, were not supposed to be destroyed and are not being destroyed as far as I understand. But also, you know, some decommunizers were so enthusiastic that they started to destroy works of art, murals and so on. And that infuriated quite a lot of people, especially if they saw them as part of the heritage of their city or town or so on. So I think the lessons that came out of this process is that we need to discuss these, and we see this. This is sort of answering your question, Robert. And we see these processes elsewhere. Eastern Europe, Ukraine, former Soviet space, definitely not unique. We saw last year Black Lives Matter movement, and you know, the toppling of monuments in the States, in Britain, in the Netherlands, and the same discussion: what do we keep? What do we contextualize? Right? And I think the answers were all: let's talk to the people to whom it matters. Right? Let's discuss this. Let's then treat each case individually and come to a solution. And I think the same applies in Eastern Europe.
Maybe I can add something to that. I think it's an excellent question in terms of the context of of Ukraine. And let me just pick up one point that connects to, again, a possible use of such a framework, which is the vexing question of the Stalin Museum in Georgia, which a person that's a friend to some in the room, in the audience, has talked about. And essentially some of our suggestions also could help structure that approach, that clearly it's a museum to be experienced, what it is like for a mass murderer to be commemorated in a particular context, but seeing that entirely uncritically, not having some counterbalance there, and wouldn't in a way do justice to it either. And so the suggestion that you should have an exhibition within the exhibition about the exhibition that allows you to experience the original exhibition, but at the same time clarify where there's total myth making because Stalin was never there, where other people have been kind of bleached out of particular paintings. So this is one example where we think that a kind of framework like this that allows you to transcend collective stories and exit certain loops can give a direction to at least consider which way you can go.
Thank you. Anna, please, you have the question.
Thank you. I'm Anna Matveeva. Probably most people know me at King's College London. Yeah, lots of questions, but of course we don't have time. I'm approaching also from a conflict resolution perspective. Yeah? So every commemoration has a narrative behind it. So what type of narratives and commemorations which follow on from them are more conflict inducive and less conflict inducive? Yeah, maybe something from your experience. Yeah, because it has to get some kind of a definite point across, which has to be visual. It is not a historical exploration where you can bring out nuances and the different views of the sites. Yeah, so it is much more kind of basic and straightforward and more or less in your face. So, for example, widespread narratives and commemorations around them. Yeah, we can look at Lebanon if we look at Middle East. Outsourcing problem to outsiders. In a way, it shifts blame, it takes it from neighboring communities. It's not Shia, it's not Palestinian refugees, it's all those others, you know, Israelis, God knows, Martians, who have done this to us, that kind of, and this is how it then remembered, and to some extent, maybe this is not a bad way of dealing with it. But of course, it's not really historically accurate, yeah, and so that's where I kind of think about your intention, yeah, and also accuracy. Because if we take any noteworthy event, normally it is associated with war and suffering. Yeah, people do not really celebrate the achievements of a five-year-old plan. Yeah, so all these events would have some kind of trauma and significant downsides. It's no, absolute villains and saints do not really exist. Whichever page of history we take. So how do we deal with this kind of just causes? In that sense that if you open the wounds, they would be showing all sides with having done something wrong to the other. Yeah, and maybe to Carrie's point, where do you see the role of states? Because the state-sponsored commemorations normally have that kind of monopoly of truth. Yeah, they have this kind of finite quality. Otherwise, they cannot really function if it's all the time, kind of everything is relative. Society, historians, civil societies, media, academics can have the luxury of that kind of debate. But again, that debate can be bringing us closer to the truth, but it can also be more conflict-inducing than others. Yeah, and we have seen examples, from the Caucasus, which I can think and I'm sure you also spring to mind. So yeah, maybe something like this.
Yep. I think there was 30 questions around this. A beautiful, poignant statement.
I've been out for 18 months.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. So conflict-inducing and less conflict-inducing. So commemoration happens in the now, and again, if if I can, just another personal story. The reason, I've got many reasons why I do this work, coming from my background, the English-Irish issues. But the other part was when I was young and I was learning Russian, I was in the Caucasus during the Second Chechen War. And there was video footage that was shown repeatedly on television of Chechen fighters who had captured some Russian conscripts and boys, and on television, in the video footage, they cut their throats, and this was shown regularly. And it was not media, this was not reporting. This was an act of commemoration that was meant to dehumanize the other. Look at our boys that have been so brutally treated. These other side, they're not human. We can do whatever we want to them. And that was, created the public support for the very intense use of violence within that the Second Chechen War. And that stuck with me as an image. So I think that's an example of conflict-inducing commemoration in the immediate form. You're showing something repeatedly because you're trying to get the support for your actions, to reinforce your authority, to make sure you're shielded from blame and so on. So I think when commemoration dehumanizes the other side, doesn't put their individual lives into context, that's when I think it's conflict-inducing, in the sense of it can enable us to move towards violence. So in a place like Ukraine and the Donbass, I want there to be justice for the suffering of people without dehumanizing families who might be on the other side, who might also have a sense of pain and suffering. So commemoration should humanize. There's a very good essay on I'll send it around to those who are interested, on how horror fiction is an attempt to dehumanize when you make yourself a voyeur in someone else's suffering. And you want people to stop being voyeurs and to start being participants in understanding what's happening around them. So I think that's one. The other part is this idea of moral autonomy. We do become trapped in the past, we become restrained by it. So, and this is why I think the Aurora Prize is such a good idea. It has, if not an intentional, the implicit attempt to make sure it's clear that Armenians are more than the genocide. They're more than the history of suffering. They have the ability to reach out to the rest of the world, understand the suffering in the rest of the world, and to make statements around the good actions of others in the rest of the world. So I think those are kind of two critical points. Are we dehumanizing the other through our commemoration? And if so, we need to stop that. And are we then allowing ourselves to be more than constrained by the important suffering that we've gone through?
If I may add, and I think, yeah, again, excellent questions. And I think you raise an important point about both the strength and also the limitations of the framework that we put forward. And the idea is, as I said, is to port something that we see working in another context, this idea of an immanent critique that Michael Walzer talks about. But the interesting thing is that in some ways the criticisms run parallel as well. So the limitations of what we suggest with the ethics of political commemoration in some ways run parallel, so that you can very well say that maybe you shouldn't touch the past at all. So you have that debate in Spain about the pact of silence. And to many of us, we might, the first impulse might be along the lines, why? Why that silence? Maybe, maybe we should talk about all that happened in Franco. But then the German writer, W.G. Sebald, touched the question of the air war and the experiences of the German under the air war. Now, I think Sebald is unimpeachable, so to speak, with the novels that he's written, the kind of haunting memories, and he's talked specifically about literature beyond the pure recitation of facts is one of the few ways that we can do a kind of moral restitution. He didn't claim it was the only, but anyway, so he talked about that. And I think rightly, many Germans reacted with unease, because the idea is, well, maybe, we know what our story is and we know what our history is, and that kind of memory of the air war And in the particular context, that was one of the reasons we also came up with this contained unfathomability. Dresden felt it needed to appoint a commission to decide how many victims there had been of the bombing. You could argue whether it's 20,000 victims or 40,000 victims. That is part of what we say is it's unfathomable anyway. So the point is, I think there's a sensible critique from the point of pacifism, pragmatic pacifism. Let the past be the past. Let's focus on the future. There's also a sensible criticism of the just war tradition and what we put forward from a kind, if you will, from a kind of means ends point of view, that you say, well, if the end is really, really, really good, then at that point, some of the constraints we should be able to sideline. And so again, we think it limits what we suggest, but I think it also strengthens the claim that there is maybe something there that's workable as a kind of coherent approach to deal with the questions at hand.
Chip in on some of the Ukrainian examples, I think. You mentioned a really important thing, the commemoration has a narrative, and this is the shift that I'm seeing in Ukraine. So what I identified earlier, the narrative at the beginning, the state-endorsed narrative was very much kind of, glorifying the war dead, which was understandable, but nevertheless probably extremely problematic, but also portraying this war as another link in the long struggle of decades, maybe centuries of Ukrainians for statehood. And that was the kind of the narrative that was put forward by the state. And I think that's become simply insufficient for much of the society. And the narrative that I hear more and more now, and I think it came out of grassroots initiatives and now is being adopted by the state as well, is that we remember the dead and we care for the living. Okay? And I think that's a much more healthy approach, much more practical approach, especially in a country that has so many war veterans, many of whom suffer from extreme cases of PTSD and also an enormous amount of post-war suicides. And not just that, but IDPs, a huge number of IDPs, people who had to flee the occupied territories and so on. So that seems to be a much more constructive narrative that is being constructed around commemoration. And you mentioned the role of the state. I think it would be naive to assume that the state doesn't have a large role to play in these practices, to preserve the commemorative sites. The Babyn is an example of that. I mean, who, other than the state, is able to say, no, that cannot be built on that site, or we have to put a stop to these initiatives until it's been discussed and accepted by society, to fund a lot of initiatives, to facilitate them, but also to legislate. So in Ukraine, there's a Ministry for Integration of Temporarily Occupied Territories, and that commission is that ministry will have a commission. I think it already has a commission that will work within the framework of transitional justice. Part of that is going to be to assess the damages done to the occupied territories, both to citizens, but also to cultural heritage. And that's a subject that's particularly important for Crimea, for instance, right? I mean, the cultural heritage is being destroyed. And then to discuss the case of reparations and so on. So the state has a massive role to play, whether what's on paper will translate itself into practice, that's another question. I think, again, civil society kicks in here to put pressure on the state to make sure that it does happen.
So, did you?
Yeah, William Dunbar from the Georgian Information Integrity Programme, but speaking on my own behalf here. So I wanted to pick up, Hans, what you said about Spain. So, I mean, it's an interesting fact that in the years immediately following the Second World War, in fact, 20 years following the Second World War, very little commemoration was done. I mean, obviously, commemoration takes place all the time, as you point out, on an individual and a familiar basis, but there was almost no state-sponsored commemoration of the Second World War in any major European state. The Soviet Union didn't start commemorating the Second World War until Brezhnev tried to sort of reimagine that Stalinist past. All the way through Khrushchev's thaw, there was no official commemoration, or very little. Similarly, I mean, Berlin only got its memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in this century. So, I mean, also de Gaulle's incredibly famous and great sort of epigram that nothing dries quicker than blood. And arguably that was true in the generation after the war, and it's not true now. And now we're living through a moment of politicized and political commemoration, which is examinable on its own terms. So is that a good thing? I mean, you know, I appreciate your attempt to put it in a framework of ethics, but the whole I mean, commemoration as a whole, commemoration in this moment now is worthy of study on its own terms beyond the ethics of it. So that's something I wanted to say. But just going beyond that a little bit into your framework in terms of what did you call it? Authority, legitimate authority. So you gave a great example of the prize in Armenia, which is a wonderful program, but that's a prize. And again, when you take that into the public realm, it's never going to be a panel of experts of George Clooney and heroes. It's going to be a political regime which has its own aims, its own limitations, and its own problems on the day. So especially when we're talking about Eastern Europe, we're talking about in Georgia and in other places that have decreasing democratic legitimacy for their governments. In other places like Ukraine, we're talking about places that can unfortunately be captured by oligarchical interest, as with the Babi Yar memorial that's coming. And so to what extent is it possible, even in the West, I mean, even in London, where they're building a Holocaust memorial in the teeth of opposition in what's known as the monument saturation zone in Westminster, which is an interesting turn of phrase. So to what extent can there ever be a truly legitimate authority on these things when we're talking about commemoration in the public space, when that's necessarily contingent on all the messiness of politics? So that's what I would like to ask.
Alessia, would you like to start?
No, I think the question is legitimate authority. I want to hear the answer.
No, look, I mean, these are very good points. And on the first one, is it appropriate at all? Well, I mean, arguably, we highlight conditions where it's not really so much. Secondly, I think you're right to highlight that a shift there in how things change. But just from our German experience, the way that German experience gets received in other countries and this is in some of the commemoration literature, it's along the lines, well, why are those perpetrators not like the Germans who just said we did it and this is what's going to happen? I think what's missing in those accounts, and I can just speak from my personal experience, was precisely how arguably a handful of individuals transcended the collective, especially Jewish authors who came back to Germany, wrote in German, and ended up integrating, so to speak, into a collective we. And I can just tell you what it was like as a teenager to be told by the school teacher, this is the way we should look at history, as opposed to reading a novel and being taken along and suddenly realizing that I was being transported along somewhere, so that I think there was indeed an extent to which a we was being, the transcending of a collective was taking place in a kind of commemoration, even though it wasn't necessarily quite with the memorials there. So that's one point. But absolutely, this is, of course, it's a worthy of study, so to speak, why this is now taking a different direction. I do think that the point that Margaret Macmillan raised explains some of that. Secondly, the question of legitimate authority. And I think the question here is not to say that anything is ever going to be entirely legitimate for very obvious reasons, but there's better and worse. There's ways in which we can work with international commissions to decide who builds the winning proposal. And there's ways in which we can balance out these claims. And I do think, and again, I can really recommend the Södertörn University report where Jenny Wüstenberg, who we also were hoping to bring here, but has documented in detail institutions of memory management and to what extent they often work through a degree of arm's length. And you do see political arrangements that work in that way, where, for example, I think appropriate commemoration of the kind that I described does involve the opposition. And the opposition plays an integral part. It would be wrong just for government authorities to work in that. And it's also, by the way, a great argument if well exercised. I realize it's a huge if, but if well exercised for the kinds of presidential roles as we see in Ireland, where we haven't talked about this today, but where Michael Higgins of Ireland has done really astounding summaries of how Ireland should deal with its decade of centenaries. And I think, again, in Germany, that you have a somewhat similar function of a president who doesn't have a direct executive role. So I think kind of institutional arrangements can be made that allow for more legitimacy, that eventually that legitimacy may be challenged by future generations or from another angle, or will leave some things out. That I think is in the nature of it.
Can I add a comment? I mean, I did not develop this framework, so I
Yes.
have to comment on it. But I just thinking about this legitimate authority, I think it's probably important to remember that when authority is not legitimate, there are other actors that step in and replace potentially this authority and are legitimate. And let's think about the dissidents in the Soviet Union. And coming back to the question of Babin Yar, I mean, those people was the position of the Soviet state was to obfuscate this memory, to commemorate the space as the space of massacre of peaceful residents of Kiev, right? You know, so not even mentioning the Holocaust at all. It wasn't a thing, an issue. But there were people like Anatoly Kuznetsov who wrote the book that is still very relevant today, describing Babin Yar, like Ivan Zuba, the dissidents, Ukrainian dissidents, who kept raising these concerns, who kept talking about it, and were commemorating in their own way. So maybe we can expand the idea of the authority or the definition of authority as legitimate authority beyond state institutions.
No, absolutely. We mean that absolutely beyond state institutions.
Yes. And that's also why we use the example of the Aurora Prize, because it's a non-state
Right.
body of legitimacy, hopefully. And just to come into this conversation, I think one thing I don't want us to lose is this sense of the legitimate authority is also looking at how the leadership, the purpose of the leadership on commemoration. Is it really with the intent of understanding, commemorating, bring people together, or does it have the purpose, as we might see in a place like Azerbaijan, of reinforcing state control over the public, of cracking down on dissidents, oppositions, the human rights space, that it's actually a shield that stops change from happening in society. So that's one thing that we really wanted to pick up on. You know, how is the group that's making decisions using those decisions to project its own authority or not? Then if you remember the initial framework, we had these ideas of the type of actions you take to own or disown. You then have the things that impact contextually now, such as laws or diplomatic actions. And then you have the things that impact contextually, such as media standards around how you refer to a thing. So each media agency has its kind of list of norms. I think on the first and the third, that is very much the sphere of civil society taking the leadership, providing the legitimate authority. If we're making decisions on what to own, what to disown, what to commemorate, that should be where civil society leads. If we're making a decision around how we talk about things, that should be civil society led. That middle sphere, when we're actually talking about laws and diplomacy, that's where we do need to have the state involved in these countries. And that's where, to come back to Labitsa's point, we need to have this, we need to find a way of engaging with them, even if it's against their interests. And that's why we were suggesting this framework could help, could potentially, given the right environment.
Well, I would like to come back to the point of the role of civil society, because we talked quite a lot about the role of the state and the resource advantage that the state has in terms of broadcasting their messages and education, of course. And but Olesya, you mentioned earlier some civil society initiatives in Ukraine in the realm of commemoration. So I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little on how much do you think civil society can achieve in a difficult environment, or what sort of gaps can bridge? And maybe if you could share a couple of examples of some creative initiatives that could provide some lessons learned in the wider region.
Thank you very much. I'd love to talk about that. So, I mean, civil society replaced the state after Maidan in the first years of the war. Months, definitely, possibly years. The army was in a terrible state. It was volunteer organizations who sort of emerged on the Maidan, I think, a lot of them, or at least the people got to know each other and became very active, started to bring provisions for the army, everything from socks and t-shirts to bulletproof vests and so on. They started to put pressure on the state to investigate the crimes of the Maidan, the shootings on the Maidan. They started to collect data immediately and still continue to do. So human rights activists and advocates continue to do this now to collect, and I think that's an extremely important part of their work, to collect testimonies of witnesses, participants, victims, and so on, of people in the occupied territories in the Crimea, to lobby for their release, to create lists of people who are held captive in Crimea, in Russia, and the temporary occupied territories of Donbass, and try and get them freed and so on. So an enormous effort is being made, and a lot of it is commemorative as well, I think. So the example of Alexandra Matvichuk that I gave you, I mean, she bases her advocacy campaign very much in dialogue with commemorative practices. So she says, you know, that there's a piece by her where she ends, I think, by saying to commemorate is to act. Right, so if you want to commemorate now, you also need to act now. It's very impressive, that sort of work, I think. In terms of initiatives, there's one particular initiative that I like, cultural initiative that I like to highlight, which I think could be very useful to study and to potentially apply elsewhere in the region. And that's the projects that were developed by a theater of displaced people. It's a very interesting group of artists set up by Natalia Voroshpyt, who might be familiar here because a lot of her plays have been staged by the Royal Court here in London, including Van Rhodes, a play that focuses on civilian experiences of this current war. Very much so. Now it's turned into a film as well. And Georg Janot, a German artist who's been working in Eastern Europe, in Russia and in Ukraine for a long time. And one particular, so this is also relates to one of the questions, I think, in chat: when do we commemorate? How soon can we commemorate? Well, immediately, because I guess you have to. I mean, a lot of the time you don't have any choice. So one of the projects of theatre of displaced people was called Children and Soldiers. And it was a sort of artistic initiative where young people from the liberated territories, formerly occupied territories, were talking to soldiers stationed there. And it was very clear right from the start that there was a lack of trust between the two groups. The soldiers did not necessarily trust the civilians, and the civilians, especially these young people, they certainly did not trust the army that was stationed there. And so they created these kind of dialogues between soldiers and young people, where these questions could be discussed, right? And they then turned these into theatre pieces. So that's one of the examples that they had many plays of that kind. I mean, this documentary theatre is developing in Ukraine really rapidly, and I think it's an excellent tool to speak about these traumas and to come to kind of, maybe not reconciliation as such, but to voice the concerns from different sides, as you describe, before some kind of truth and reconciliation commission is put in place.
Can I add in there, Hans? I think you brought this up too, but in addition to civil society, we're seeing a real role for the arts,
Yes.
which can be a counter force to government in its ability to spread the word. Now, hopefully, the good word with the right intention. As you lay out in your framework, there's a chance the arts could go the other way.
Yeah.
But the right novel, the right film, the right theater production really can cast people into a thinking framework they weren't in before, where the government had put out very specific narrative. And as people hear it, they know that richness in the artistic presentation reflects better the reality they know was true.
Right.
Richness and honesty.
In honesty.
No, that if I may, I mean, the arts, that relates to the question also that Robert Brinkley, if I recall the name correctly, asked about Ukraine. One of the examples that struck me very early and maybe also made me interested in this was how you dealt with the challenge of the German Ministry of Finance. Has anyone been to the German, here in the room? I guess we cannot see from the chat, but has anyone been to the German Ministry of Finance? It's the German Ministry of Finance is on the fateful street of the Wilhelmstrasse, which is the site, of course, where the Reichschancellery was, and then also the center of terror, so to speak. And the building itself, in which now the Ministry of Finance is is the building that Goering had built for himself as the Luftwaffe ministry. Huge building, 1930s modernist, fascist building style, in itself still architecturally interesting. The GDR, the East Germans, once they moved in, of course, needed also, it was still standing because it was solidly built, partially, I think, because of the idea, the Ruinenwert, the idea that buildings should be built in such a way that even if they were falling down, they should still stand as ruins. So with a shortage of buildings, they moved into that, but had to exercise, if that is the right word, the spirit of the Goering ministry, and they put a socialist mural. And it has all the things you expect from a socialist murals: happy workers, women farmers handing down the wheat from a truck, smiling children, people with their Losung, with their kind of placards moving along. And then again, post-unification, the question, how do you deal with that? You have, of course, the first layer of the fascist building style. You have the mural. Do you do effacement, which can be a decision in some cases that you just removed altogether, of course. But the decision was to use a relatively small intervention of art and to have a stripe on the ground, maybe 10 meters away, that is maybe this large, which is just a photograph of faces, most likely of workers, protesting on June 17, 1953, a protest that was suppressed violently. And so what you do with an intervention through art is you, on the one hand, you have the mural, and on the other hand, the mural also has its comment. And again, I do think that is, to me, is a little bit that unfathomability. You stand in front of it, you go closer to one thing, you move away from it, you see whether you can bring all of those into perspective, and you walk away with still making up your mind about it all. And that, I think, is an example, again, is one way, and again, may relate a little bit to questions of statues in Ukraine or in other contexts as well.
And finally, as we don't have much time left, I would like to get to the question of ownership, because you mentioned that you're kind of developing this framework to be adopted more broadly. So I would like to know what has been the response in the region when you presented in the various practical contexts that you work in.
I'll answer that first.
Let's put it this way, we're interested in hearing from people. We're interested in hearing from people here. We're also interested in hearing from people that are not, unfortunately, cannot be present here, that want to challenge us and that force us through that challenge to also think about refining that. But it's in the sense the ownership is, how has this arisen? This has arisen from all of us who care. I haven't been engaged with Karabakh as long as the ambassador, but all of us who care about the region, I think last year, we're watching the online debate. We're watching the fragmentation of the online debate about Karabakh, where sides held up particular things. And eventually also the realization that the world is not made up of shards, or if you just look through shards, you'll see something that is colored in a particular way, and really complex social and political and historical reality in many ways is more like a church window that is made up of little pieces, but you actually have to put that together. And so, this in our case came through conversations, and it's certainly something that I hope to learn from others through more conversations as well.
And from the practitioner stance, which is where we're reflecting off each other, building on something Alyssa says, commemoration happens immediately, it's ongoing. And what's often happening is the politics is catching up with what the public are doing. And I think what we're looking for is, when I'm in a world of working on conflict, working with the parties, is better being able to understand how that commemoration is ongoing and how it's impacting on their ability to negotiate, get agreement, agree institutions. So that's where I think one of the focus is for us here, and helping that political catch up to be more effective and to be more connected to the views and perspectives of people, rather than to be completely disconnected. In terms of, to answer your question directly, on the Armenian Turkey question, we got a lot of challenges. And we got a lot of discrete messages of support, which talks about the challenge of the public space because many of those challenges were based upon people not believing that we meant it. People not believing that we really wanted to engage, people not believing themselves in that the other side had a proper narrative. So a lot of it came from that. And then you have those people who do want to break that deadlock. So I think on that point, we had the challenges, which is great. That's why we're here. And then we had the private support, which is great. That fills us with hope. What I think we're looking to do is to capture some of the examples that you're saying from Ukraine, which is just, I mean, what I heard today was wonderful in terms of the richness of the way that Ukrainian society is dealing with the shifting landscape of trauma and dealing with the past. And the phrase that you said that stood out to me were most prominently was this idea that how can we commemorate what's happening now if we haven't worked out how to commemorate what happened in the Second World War. And I think what we're also talking about here is a culture of commemoration, how we encourage those in conflict to be better at doing it. So long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but I'm kind of very excited about continuing this work with, and whoever wants to join us, please do.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a fascinating discussion, and a lot of work lies ahead. And my colleagues and I look forward to revisiting this on a future occasion. Best of luck with this ambitious project. And that's all we have time for today, I'm afraid. So thank you again to our excellent panel, to Hans, David, and Alessia. Thank you to all our participants here at Chatham House, but also online. Thank you for all the questions. And just a reminder that today's discussion was on the record, and there'll be a video of this online later on. And you can find out more about our future events on the Chatham House website. And we very much look forward to seeing you again here at Chatham House, but also online.